You stayed up all night. By 6 in the morning, the eyes burned with a gritty heat that blinking could not resolve. By noon the next day, a strange emotional fragility had settled in, a vulnerability you could not explain through simple tiredness alone. A comment from a colleague that would normally pass without registering landed like an accusation. You nearly snapped at a stranger in a queue for no reason you could identify. By evening, the edges of objects in the peripheral vision started behaving incorrectly. A flicker of movement where nothing had moved. A shadow that shifted direction when the light source had not changed. You attributed all of it to being tired, to needing rest, to having pushed too hard. Tiredness was the least significant thing happening inside you. You have experienced pieces of what comes next. Everyone has pulled an all-nighter, missed a full night before a flight, or lain awake staring at the ceiling until dawn wondering whether sleep would arrive at all. What happened inside your body during those hours followed a sequence that was predictable. Each system failed at a specific hour. Emotional regulation collapsed first, motor coordination degraded second, perception distorted third, and immune surveillance suppressed fourth. Each failure traces to a specific structure running out of a specific resource at a measurable rate, and the order of the failures reveals something about the brain you have never been told. The body fails in stages when sleep is removed, each stage predictable, each one mapping to a system that ran out of capacity in a measurable order. The order is the hierarchy of metabolic cost. The brain sacrifices the most expensive functions first and preserves the most fundamental last. The triage follows the same principle the body uses during hypothermia, sacrificing the extremities to preserve the core, applied to brain regions instead of peripheral limbs. The most expensive neural computation goes offline first. The most primitive function survives longest. 3 processes run during sleep that no amount of quiet rest, meditation, or lying still with the eyes closed can replicate. The heaviness you feel at midnight, the pressure that builds behind the eyes and in the temples across every waking hour, is a molecule called adenosine, accumulating in the spaces between your brain cells. Adenosine is a byproduct of the energy your neurons consume. Every hour you stay awake, the concentration rises. The molecule presses on the circuits that keep you alert, dampening their activity like a dimmer switch being turned down slowly across the day. By midnight, 16 hours into the waking period, the adenosine concentration has risen high enough in the extracellular space that the pressure to sleep becomes difficult to resist. The second wind that sometimes arrives at 1 or 2 in the morning is the circadian alerting signal from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, temporarily overriding the adenosine pressure, the circadian clock pushing back against the chemical load for a few hours before the load overwhelms the clock as well. The second wind feels like recovery. It is a temporary override that delays the collapse without reducing the accumulation driving it. Caffeine blocks the receptors adenosine binds to, temporarily lifting the pressure without clearing the molecule. The caffeine masks the signal. The adenosine continues accumulating behind the mask. When the caffeine wears off, the accumulated load hits at once, which is why the crash after late afternoon coffee feels dramatically worse than the tiredness the coffee was covering. Sleep clears the adenosine through a mechanism waking rest cannot replicate. During the deep phases of sleep, the brain activates a drainage system that flushes the accumulated adenosine out through the fluid surrounding the brain cells. The clearance requires sleep specifically. The drainage system runs at a fraction of its capacity during waking hours because the cellular architecture of the brain physically reconfigures during sleep, the cells shrinking slightly to open the channels the fluid moves through. The channels are narrow during waking. They widen during sleep. The mechanism has been demonstrated directly in animal models. Human evidence is consistent with the animal data, though direct measurement of lymphatic flow during human sleep remains an active area of research. The molecule that has been pressing on the wake circuits all day clears through channels that only open fully when you stop using them. Waking rest, meditation, and lying quietly with closed eyes do not clear it. Sleep clears it because sleep is the only state in which the drainage channels open wide enough for the fluid to flush the accumulation. Simultaneously, every experience during the waking day strengthened connections between neurons. Every conversation, every visual observation, every piece of new information that entered the brain reinforced the synapses that processed it. By the end of a 16-hour day, the total synaptic strength across the cortex has increased measurably. The brain has become louder, every circuit running hotter than it was at the start of the day, the signal-to-noise ratio degrading, because every signal got stronger, but the noise floor rose with it across every circuit. Sleep restores the ratio. During slow-wave sleep, the brain reduces the synaptic strength proportionally, preserving the relative differences between important memories and unimportant ones, while lowering the absolute volume across all circuits. The foggy feeling after a missed night of sleep is the brain operating at a gain setting that should have been recalibrated during the sleep that never arrived. And the third function, the memories sitting in the hippocampus, the short-term buffer that holds the day's experiences, need to be transferred to long-term storage in the cortex. The transfer happens during slow-wave sleep through a replay mechanism where the hippocampus fires the pattern of each memory back to the cortex for permanent encoding. Without sleep, the transfer stalls. The buffer stays full. The capacity to encode new memories the next day drops because the buffer that should have been emptied and reset overnight is still holding yesterday's contents. 3 functions: adenosine clearance, synaptic recalibration, and memory transfer. All 3 require sleep specifically. All 3 accumulate deficits with every hour of wakefulness beyond 16. And the first system to degrade when these functions are denied is the one that costs the brain the most energy to run. What fails first, and why does it fail in that specific order? The prefrontal cortex, the structure sitting behind your forehead that runs emotional regulation, impulse control, decision-making, and judgment. The prefrontal cortex consumes more glucose per gram of tissue than any other structure in the brain. It runs the most computationally expensive operations the brain performs, the operations that distinguish considered, deliberate human behavior from reflexive, automatic animal response. And because it runs the highest cost operations, it is the first structure to degrade when the energy supply is compromised by the adenosine accumulation and the synaptic noise that sleep deprivation produces. Well, the felt experience at 17 to 24 hours without sleep is familiar to anyone who has pulled an all-nighter. Irritability that arrives without a cause you can name. Emotional reactions disproportionate to the trigger. A joke that you would normally laugh at producing anger instead. A minor frustration producing tears or a wave of sadness with no identifiable source. The emotional volatility is the prefrontal cortex losing its grip on a structure sitting deeper in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala processes threat, fear, and emotional intensity. The fear discussion described the circuit in full. The amygdala fires the alarm. The prefrontal cortex evaluates whether the alarm is justified and dampens it if the threat is not real. The brake and the accelerator. Sleep deprivation degrades the brake while amplifying the accelerator. After 35 hours without sleep, the amygdala responded to emotional images with 60% greater reactivity than it showed after a full night of rest, as you and colleagues demonstrated in Nature Neuroscience. Simultaneously, the functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the wiring that carries the braking signal, showed measurably reduced strength. The brake weakened while the accelerator intensified. You at 20 hours without sleep are experiencing the physical degradation of the circuit that regulates emotion because the structure that runs the brake consumed its energy budget before any other region in the brain could reach its own limit. Metabolic cost is why the prefrontal cortex fails first. The brain allocates energy in proportion to demand, and the prefrontal cortex demands more per gram than any other region. When the energy supply is compromised, the highest demand region crosses the deficit threshold first. The way the device with the largest battery drain always dies first when the shared power supply weakens. The emotional collapse at 17 to 24 hours is the brain's most expensive circuit running out of fuel before any other circuit reaches its limit. And the cognitive equivalence is measurable. After 17 to 19 hours without sleep, reaction time and sustained attention degrade to the level produced by a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%, roughly 2 drinks on an empty stomach. By 24 hours, the equivalence reaches 0.10%, above the legal driving limit in every jurisdiction that sets one, as Williamson and Fayer established in occupational and environmental medicine. The equivalence is specific to psychomotor vigilance and sustained attention. Other cognitive domains degrade through different mechanisms, but the reaction time of a person awake for 24 hours is the reaction time of a person too impaired to legally drive. The body felt functional. The brain was performing at the measurable equivalent of legal impairment. If the prefrontal cortex degraded first because it runs the costliest computations, and the emotional regulation lost its brake. What happens when the brain has been awake for 24 hours, and the sleep circuits in the brainstem decide they have waited long enough? Sleep is mandatory. The brain takes sleep without asking permission. At 24 to 36 hours without sleep, the brainstem's sleep circuits begin overriding voluntary wakefulness with microsleeps, involuntary sleep episodes lasting 1 to 15 seconds. You are unaware of most of them. The eyes remain open during many microsleeps. The body maintains its posture. But the brain has flipped from waking to sleeping for seconds at a time, and during each microsleep, visual processing stops, motor control pauses, and reaction time drops to effectively zero. You're functionally blind and unresponsive for 1 to 15 seconds without knowing it happened. Underneath that loss of control is a competition between two switches in the brainstem, a sleep switch and a wake switch, each one suppressing the other in a mutual inhibition circuit that neuroscience has mapped in detail. When one switch dominates, the other is silenced. During normal waking, the wake switch holds control and the sleep switch is suppressed. During normal sleep, the sleep switch holds control and the wake switch is silenced. The design prevents the brain from sitting in an intermediate state between waking and sleeping, the same way a light switch prevents a bulb from sitting at half brightness. The flip is binary, fully on or fully off. After 24 hours of continuous waking, the accumulating sleep pressure, driven by the adenosine load and the synaptic noise the drainage system has not cleared, begins tipping the competition. The sleep switch wins brief battles. The brain flips to sleep for seconds, then the wake switch reclaims control, then the sleep switch wins again. The microsleeps are the two switches fighting for dominance in a system where the sleep pressure has risen high enough that the wake switch can no longer maintain continuous control. And then, the microsleeps carry a consequence you rarely consider. A microsleep while driving at highway speed covers 100 to 400 meters without a conscious driver. Microsleep-related accidents are a leading cause of single-vehicle highway crashes because the driver does not brake, does not steer, and does not respond to the road for the full duration of the episode. The brain seized control because sleep was denied. The seizure happened at the moment the consequences were highest. I drew a 22-hour line on wakefulness the month I learned that microsleeps are involuntary. A hard limit. The brain will take what it needs regardless, and the physics of when it takes it does not account for whether you are driving, operating equipment, or standing at the top of a staircase. The microsleep arrives when the pressure exceeds the wake switch's capacity to resist, regardless of context. You have experienced the precursor without recognizing it. The head nod during a late-night drive that you caught at the last second. The sentence you read 3 times without absorbing a word. The moment in a meeting where someone asked your opinion and you realized you had not heard the previous 45 seconds of conversation. Each of those moments was the sleep switch winning a brief skirmish, the wake switch barely managed to recover from. The full microsleep, the one where the switch flips completely for 5 or 10 seconds, is the battle the wake switch loses entirely. The difference between the head nod and the microsleep is the difference between a brief voltage fluctuation and a blackout, and the brain does not announce which one is coming. Now, 2 systems have failed. The prefrontal cortex lost its capacity at 24 hours. The brainstem began seizing sleep at 36. Your emotional regulation and voluntary wakefulness have both degraded. What happens to the systems that operate below conscious awareness, the ones you cannot feel degrading? Failures reach the immune surveillance and the cognitive architecture simultaneously, and the speed at which they collapse is the most underreported finding in sleep research. 1 night of restricted sleep, not 1 week, not chronic insomnia across months. A single night of restricted sleep reduced the activity of natural killer cells, the immune cells that patrol the bloodstream, identifying and destroying virus-infected cells and early-stage cancer cells, by up to 72% in some protocols, as Irwin and colleagues measured in the archives of internal medicine. The immune surveillance the body maintains continuously, the system that catches threats before they establish, dropped by roughly half to 3/4 from a single night of inadequate sleep. The natural killer cells that forced air enhances are the cells sleep deprivation suppresses. Sleep deprivation suppresses them through the opposite direction of the same pathway. The practical consequence is invisible because immune surveillance operates below conscious awareness. You do not feel your natural killer cells patrolling. You do not feel them identifying a virus-infected cell and destroying it before the infection establishes. You feel the absence only when the surveillance fails and the infection takes hold. The cold that arrives 2 or 3 days after the poor night of sleep, the illness that seems to find you during the weeks when work or travel disrupted the sleep schedule. You never connected the two events because the disrupted night happened on Tuesday and the sore throat arrived on Friday. The surveillance drop happened silently, without symptoms, 2 to 3 days before the pathogen exploited the gap it left. Cognitive collapse arrives on that timeline. Working memory, the mental workspace where you hold information while using it, contracts from its normal capacity of 4 to 7 items down to 2 to 3. You who could follow a 3-step instruction at noon cannot hold the second step in mind by the following midnight. Reaction times on sustained attention tasks increase by 100 to 300%, with complete attention lapses where the brain produces no response at all for several seconds. The lapses are microsleep intrusions into the cognitive task. The brainstem's sleep switch winning momentary battles during a task that requires continuous wakefulness. Then the metabolic consequences arrive alongside the cognitive and immune collapse. Evening cortisol, which should be declining as the body prepares for sleep, rises instead. The cortisol discussion described the consequences of sustained evening elevation, visceral fat accumulation, insulin resistance, disrupted glucose metabolism. Sleep deprivation activates the cortisol loop from the outside, producing the elevated evening cortisol profile through a different entry point. Glucose tolerance decreases measurably after just 2 consecutive nights of restricted sleep, as Spiegel and colleagues reported in The Lancet. Insulin receptor downregulation accelerates under the metabolic stress sleep deprivation imposes. 2 nights of poor sleep producing measurable changes in how the body processes glucose. Eating the same breakfast after 2 nights of restricted sleep produces a higher glucose spike than eating that breakfast after 2 nights of adequate sleep. The food was identical. The sleep changed the machinery that processes it. The insulin receptors downregulated. The glucose clearance slowed. The postprandial spike climbed higher and lasted longer, driving the Maillard cross-linking chemistry on every protein the glucose contacts, identical chemistry running on collagen and crystalline across every tissue. 2 nights of poor sleep accelerated a chemistry that runs on every protein in the body. Well, the immune system suppressed, the metabolism dysregulated, the cognitive capacity at minimum. The brain has been awake for 48 hours. The next failure is perceptual. The brain begins generating content it can no longer distinguish from external reality. 2 days awake, every expensive function offline, the fundamental function still holding. If the brain generates its own perceptual content during dreaming, and the systems that keep dream content inside the dreaming state have degraded, what happens when the dream content leaks into waking consciousness? At 48 to 72 hours, the perceptual world begins to distort in ways you cannot dismiss as tiredness. The walls appear to breathe. Patterns in carpets and wallpaper seem to move. Shadows in the peripheral vision acquire substance and direction. Sounds arrive without identifiable sources. The distortions are internally generated perceptual content reaching the conscious mind because the gating systems that normally contain this content inside the sleeping brain have degraded past their functional threshold. Dreamlike imagery is leaking into waking perception through circuits that fire during REM sleep and are normally silenced during waking. After 48 to 72 hours of continuous wakefulness, dopamine regulation in the brain's reward and salience circuits becomes dysregulated from the prolonged waking, and the prefrontal reality testing circuits that would normally identify internally generated content as not real are already offline from the metabolic exhaustion that arrived hours earlier. 3 convergent failures, REM-related circuits activating during waking, dopamine dysregulation amplifying the salience of irrelevant stimuli, and prefrontal reality testing too degraded to filter any of it. The experience resembles acute psychosis because several of the underlying mechanisms overlap with those observed in psychotic episodes. You at 60 hours do not recognize the distortions as distortions. The peripheral movement feels real. The sound without a source feels real. The paranoid interpretation of a neutral comment feels justified. The reality testing that would normally flag these perceptions as internally generated has been offline for hours, and without reality testing, Every perception carries equal weight regardless of whether it originated in the external world or in the exhausted brain. The experience is terrifying precisely because you cannot distinguish the false content from the real content, and the terror amplifies the amygdala reactivity that was already running at 60% above baseline with near zero prefrontal braking. The hallucinations feed the fear system. The fear system amplifies the hallucinations. The loop runs unchecked until sleep intervenes or the deprivation ends. Randy Gardner stayed awake for 264 hours under supervised conditions in 1964, 11 days. By day 4, Gardner was experiencing hallucinations and paranoid ideation. By day 11, his speech was fragmented and his affect flat. After just 14 hours of recovery sleep, his cognitive function returned to near normal. The brain suffered no detectable permanent structural damage. Recovery sleep compressed the sleep stages the brain needed most, prioritizing slow-wave sleep and REM in cycles that cleared the deficit faster than it had accumulated. The brain knew precisely what it needed and took it in the order the deficit demanded. The first recovery night was dominated by slow-wave sleep, the phase that clears adenosine and recalibrates synaptic strength. The second night was dominated by REM, the phase that processes emotional memories and consolidates procedural learning. The brain actively restructured the architecture of sleep itself to prioritize the phases that addressed the largest deficits first. The triage that governed the failure sequence during deprivation also governed the recovery sequence during restoration. The single most depleted function restored first. The prefrontal cortex, sitting behind your forehead and running emotional regulation at the highest metabolic rate of any brain structure, degrades first. Hours 17 to 24. The hippocampus, running memory encoding at the second highest demand, fills its buffer without consolidation. Hours 20 to 30. The motor cortex and cerebellum, running coordination and reaction time, degrade measurably by 24 hours. The thalamus, running sensory filtering and gating, loses its capacity to block irrelevant stimuli from reaching conscious awareness. The primary sensory cortex, running the most fundamental processing, the last function the brain would sacrifice, degrades last, at 48 to 72 hours, when even the basic perception of reality becomes unreliable. Ordering follows metabolic demand the way hypothermia follows thermal priority. The ordering tracks metabolic costs closely enough to propose the triage as the organizing framework, though direct measurement of the exact failure sequence during human deprivation has not been performed with sufficient temporal resolution to confirm the precise order. When the body's core temperature drops, blood flow withdraws from the extremities first, the fingers and toes losing circulation before the arms and legs before the torso before the brain. The last structure to lose blood flow is the brain, because the brain is the most essential organ. Sleep deprivation follows the inverse of this logic within the brain itself. Expensive computations are sacrificed first, the way the extremities are sacrificed first in hypothermia, because sacrificing the expensive function preserves energy for the functions that matter more to survival. Emotional regulation is expensive and can be sacrificed without immediate death. Sensory perception is fundamental and is preserved until the system has nothing left to preserve it with. And the triage explains every symptom you have attributed to stress, aging, or personality. The short temper after a bad night is prefrontal metabolic depletion. The inability to concentrate on a complex document after 2 nights of poor sleep is hippocampal buffer overflow. The clumsiness that arrives after an all-nighter is motor cortex degradation. The address is specific. Every symptom has a specific address. I laid the hierarchy against my own schedule the evening the triage analogy became specific. The irritability at 20 hours was the prefrontal cortex, expensive structure, going offline first. The microsleeps at 36 were the brainstem seizing control because the wake circuits could no longer effectively resist. The hallucinations at 60 were the last firewall, basic reality testing, finally failing after every other system had already degraded. The sequence was the hypothermia logic applied to brain regions instead of limbs, the identical logic the body uses when it sacrifices a frostbitten toe to save the heart. Then, the lethal question. Can you die from not sleeping? Fatal familial insomnia is a prion disease that destroys the thalamic circuits responsible for initiating sleep. Progressive insomnia escalates over months into complete inability to sleep, followed by autonomic dysfunction, cognitive collapse, organ failure, and death within 12 to 18 months. Every documented case has been fatal. Whether the insomnia itself kills or the prion's broader destruction of brain tissue kills remains unresolved, because the prion damages more than the sleep circuits alone. In animal studies, rats kept awake indefinitely through mechanical stimulation died within 11 to 32 days from thermoregulatory collapse and metabolic exhaustion. In humans, no verified death from sleep deprivation alone has been documented. Gardner survived 11 days without documented permanent damage, though the experience remains the outer boundary of what has been observed under controlled conditions in a human subject. But every major disease pathway, cardiovascular, metabolic, immune, neurological, accelerates under chronic sleep restriction. Sleep deprivation accelerates every mechanism that does. One question remains unanswered: whether sleep deprivation alone can kill a human. What is established across multiple independent research programs is that every system that failed across these hours, the emotional regulation, the immune surveillance, the metabolic balance, the cognitive architecture, also degrades under chronic partial sleep restriction. 6 hours instead of 8 every night, across years. The deficit requires only a nightly shortage. You who sleep 6 hours instead of 8 accumulate 2 hours of deficit per night, 14 hours per week, a full missed night every 4 days. The adenosine that should have cleared fully during 8 hours of drainage cleared partially during 6, and the residual accumulated into the next day, and the next day's residual accumulated into the day after. The synaptic recalibration that should have restored the signal-to-noise ratio ran at partial capacity, leaving the brain operating at an elevated gain setting the next morning, slightly noisier, slightly less precise, slightly more emotionally reactive than it would have been after the full recalibration the 8 hours would have provided. The deficit compounds silently across months and years of accumulated shortage because you adapt to the degraded performance and recalibrate your sense of normal downward until the impaired state feels baseline. You stop noticing the deficit because you forgot what the non-deficit state felt like. The person who sleeps 8 hours after weeks of 6 describes the difference as dramatic. A clarity and emotional steadiness they had forgotten was available. A baseline they had adjusted steadily downward, so gradually the adjustment was invisible, until the full night restored what the deficit had been quietly removing. Eyes burned at 6 in the morning, the emotions fractured by noon, the edges of objects distorted by nightfall. The body failed in stages when sleep was removed, each system at a specific hour, each one running out of a specific resource at a specific rate. The sequence tracked the hierarchy of energy budget, the brain sacrificing expensive functions first and preserving the most fundamental last. The deprivation requires only a deficit, and the deficit has been running.